If you look at the textbook, you'll notice that each chapter, each tradition that we've studied, South Asia, China, Korea, Japan, the textbook ends with just one artwork to gesture toward modern South Asia, not at all a comprehensive story of modern art in South Asia. Just one artist. This is equally true of China, the modern period. There's the heading, and it's just a couple of paragraphs and a single artist, Wu Guanzhong, a very interesting artist and quite a remarkably interesting comparison to Shi Tao. But so on with Korea and with Japan, it's very clear this is hardly enough to get the story. And while you may feel frustrated, I want to know more. I feel frustrated too. If only there was time to learn more, to talk more about this. The problem is that when we come to the 20th and 21st century, the story is about globalism, colonialism, and the massive changes, breakdowns, tensions, and rejections of past traditions while those traditions are revived. So in other words, I'm saying the past continues to inform the present, but we can't really speak anymore of a South Asian tradition that's separate from globalization, or a Chinese tradition that is separate from the forces that completely overturn the traditional systems. Our project is focused on learning the discrete, particular histories and artistic traditions of the traditional cultures of India, of China, of Japan and Korea. But they are no longer discrete. That's discrete. They are no longer sort of their own boundaried cultural tradition by the time we get to the 20th century, because colonialism has so accelerated a process of globalization and of the undoing of old ways that related to the growth of capitalism and industrialization, so that no part of the globe is truly untouched, even though China is never colonized, and there are large parts of South America that are uncolonized in 1900. Nevertheless, capitalism, industrialization, globalization are overthrowing the old life ways. And so this quote here, "All that is solid melts into air," is one of the most brilliant descriptions of how the traditional life ways of different societies has been destabilized by this process. This is a quote from Karl Marx, and you don't have to endorse Marx or Marxism to recognize that he was a profoundly incisive describer of what was going on in his time in the 19th century. So we can speak of post-colonial artists of South Asian heritage. Mira Mukherjee and Anish Kapoor are both very in touch with the great tradition of South Asia, but they are also working in relationship to what is called modernism, which arose in Europe and New York, in Europe and America, as a kind of challenging of traditions, and an art that is pursuing innovation and experimentation, and often outright rejecting traditional artistic standards and procedures. And so they are sort of in dialogue with both of those. So Mira Mukherjee studied in Europe, and she's exposed to artists like David Smith and his Tank Totem, who are modernists, an American modernist in an avant-garde tradition, in an avant-garde experiment, which means he's making a sculpture in a new way. He's using metal parts, hubcaps, to try to create a figure of the 20th century, the age of industrialization. But she does return to South Asia, and she actually revives techniques of traditional sculptures to make this sculpture that depicts Ashoka at Kalinga. You know that event. So she's looking back to the history of South Asia, its great events, and using a distorted, expressive, formal language to convey the power of this event in a way that it would not have been done prior to the 20th century, and yet is certainly in touch with the great tradition of figurative sculpture in South Asia. So Anish Kapoor is very interesting because he actually lives, he is the part of the Indian diaspora and lives in Britain. And yet his art is very much continuing South Asian traditions. This sculpture with these amazingly intense red pigment powders formed into conical mountains and round forms. They allude to Hindu temple practices, the practice of puja, the offering of incense, the offering of color. But he's also responding to Western modernism and postmodernism, the idea of abstraction, which was so important in the New York school that Barnett Newman belongs to, a vast canvas of pure red with what he called zips down the middle, the regular geometric industrial forms of sculpture that is part of minimalism. So he's alluding to that in the simplicity of his forms. And all of that comes together in an amazing way in this monumental sculpture in Chicago. Its title is Cloudgate. And he talks about his intention here. He wanted to engage the skyline. So he uses this metal surface, which was actually crafted in a highly technical way. It involves seamlessly putting together metal plates using a computer engineering to fit them so they create this unusual form that's affectionately called the bean, although he doesn't really like that term. He likes the term umphalas, the navel. So the navel and the sky. Well, that should bring to mind for us as students of South Asian art, the navel and the sky, the Hindu temple again, with the yoni and the lingam, the female womb receptive space and the male sky pointing generative form. It should help us think about also the Taj Mahal, which we saw was related to the sky and has the water channels that reflect. But we can also think of it in terms of this idea he has of the viewer's experience, which is very much like a temple, that the viewer will enter a very deep chamber that does, in a way, the same thing to one's reflection as the exterior of the piece is doing to the reflection of the city around. So you enter this and you experience a vision of yourself in relationship to this and in relationship to the sky. This becomes an artwork that alters your consciousness in a transcendent way, just as temples are and mosques will do. So we looked at the long sweep of Chinese history and art, a very resilient tradition, so resilient that we can speak of it as 3,000 plus years and still evolving, the world's oldest continuous culture with a language still in use. Yet nevertheless, this culture is dramatically shaken, shattered, and overturned in the 20th century, as so many are, because the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries were the age of revolution, along with being the age of industrialization and the age of commercialization and globalization. They were the age of revolutionary ideas. So, and certainly capitalism as an economic form was a revolutionary form. The 19th century was a kind of tragic century for China, in which it has tremendous economic and cultural power, but its confrontations with the West are increasingly imbalanced. The British imported from China tea, silk, porcelain, numerous Chinese commodities, but the Chinese didn't want British goods. They didn't really want wool sweaters. I'm making a joke there. So what happens is the British, rather diabolically, discover that opium can become the trade commodity of choice that allows them to establish a trade balance with China. They actually have a campaign in Britain. Britain has a campaign to get people in China hooked on opium. And what arises from this are the Opium Wars, which are a conflict, both economic and military, as well as social, because China attempts to suppress opium from being traded by the British. There's widespread addiction, serious social and economic problems. So in 1839, the Chinese government confiscated the opium warehouse at Canton by British merchants. This winds up creating a conflict that explodes into war. And so this is a question of Western powers aggressively pushing trade access, the use of the military to push capitalist trade. But this is not the only difficulty. There are also internal problems in China. Natural disasters, that should say natural, not a weak state, and numerous rebellions, all of which produce a kind of cascade of crises that result in a collapse and the revolutionary overthrow of the Qing dynasty, the end of the imperial rule we've been studying, and the establishment of a republic. But this republic is weak, and it is a republic that is founded at a very difficult time in human history because World War I is about to happen. So there is warlordism in China, battles for power among factions. Then there is, in 1927, the horrific Japanese invasion, the Japanese massacre of huge numbers of the Chinese population. And, of course, World War II. So this republic is born in a time of immense violence across the world. And the civil war that breaks out will lead to another revolution, which is the communist overthrow of the republic and Mao Zedong establishing the People's Republic of China, a communist state government that quickly proves to be totalitarian, total control of the populace, massive repression, starvation, and what is called re-education, thought control. So how do artists respond to this series of immense historical traumas and the loss of the traditional social and cultural systems? This scattering of images is meant to give you a sense of how much confusion there is and how much range of possibility there is amidst that confusion. So we see here Shi Tao, traditional literati painting that had a political oppositional content. We're also looking at the French painter Eugène Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People, which was marking 1830, a point in the West where revolutionary uprisings were in the name of governments that would be established of the people, by the people, for the people. And yet that did not happen in any way easily or universally. And then we're looking here at a communist Chinese propaganda poster. And what does it say? Destroy the old world, build a new world. So that was the call, that communism was going to destroy the old world that had caused so much oppression and build a new world. And the image is the cliche of communist propaganda of a worker who's always depicted in this propaganda as male and who's fiercely swinging a sledgehammer to destroy the old. And you can maybe not see so well under the worker's feet, but he's crushing a Buddha sculpture. He's crushing Jesus and the Confucius classics. This is a kind of idea that everything must go.